Quarantine Zone is one of the Halo series' most interesting missions, not only because it takes place immediately after the previous mission's sacred icon, but because most of players' time is spent fighting enemies in vehicles. In my first video analysing this Halo 2 two-parter, which you can watch by clicking the card on screen now, I looked at the good and bad parts of Sacred Icon in more detail, and this time it's the turn of Quarantine Zone. So let's not waste any more time and jump right in. Prior to the start of Quarantine Zone, players journeyed with the Arbiter through an enormous Forerunner facility and reached ground level with the ultimate goal of reaching the Delta Halo's library. Sacred Icon started off relatively well, but it became repetitive the longer it went on, with long stretches of combat against the Flood in mostly uninspiring areas, making it feel a little like it had outstayed its welcome by the time it reached its conclusion. Before things get underway again, a brief but rousing cutscene at the start of Quarantine Zone sets things up nicely and acts as a much needed bookmark between the two missions at a point when some players may have been feeling a touch fatigued. Unlike Sacred Icon before it, Quarantine Zone begins brightly, with players most likely hopping in a nearby ghost to take on an enforcer and a few sentinels which emerge from a nearby doorway. This feels like a natural progression from the on-foot battles with those same enemies during the previous mission. Players took on a single enforcer first, with grunts and jackals lending a helping hand, before taking on an enforcer, sentinels and the Flood on their own, and here Bungie put some of the power back into their hands with an opening skirmish that they shouldn't find particularly taxing compared to those previous encounters. Quarantine Zone then throws in a twist in the next room, which is one of my favourite moments not just during this mission, but during the entirety of Halo 2. When players enter the next room, the first thing they'll likely catch partial sight of through a gap in the area's architecture is an enforcer. At the same time, the soundtrack begins to immediately swell, despite what lies ahead looking like a relatively straightforward encounter, and no doubt spurred on by their relatively easy victory against an enforcer and friends mere moments prior, and the music. I'd imagine there were a lot of players who charged straight into battle once again, but as they rounded the corner, no doubt preparing to bask in the glory of easily taking down yet another gigantic robot, they'd quickly realise two things: that there are more enforcers in the area than they expected based on the initial information Bungie gave them when they first entered it, and much more shockingly, that it's not only humans and the Covenant who can pilot vehicles, the Flood have learned to do it too. This is a very unexpected turn of events. In Combat Evolved, the Flood definitely did not possess this ability, yet here they appear at the controls of ghosts, warthogs, and if players aren't quick enough to cross the area, a scorpion as well. An arena that didn't look particularly exciting to begin with suddenly becomes much more entertaining than expected, and the battle which follows is a tight, engaging experience. The scorpion at the far end of the area is a great addition too, in that it acts almost as a timer of sorts and sets up a risk-reward scenario. Players will likely first spot it from a distance, and they then have a decision to make. They can head straight for it and risk being overwhelmed in the process, knowing that if they do succeed, they'll be nigh on unstoppable, or they can try to clear out the surrounding area first to make their path to the tank easier, but also run the risk of the Flood getting to it before they do, which would be a big problem. It's design that encourages quick decision making, which is something Bungie implements so well throughout the trilogy during everything from large scale encounters like this one, all the way through to the smaller firefights which take place far more frequently. Players are tricked at the start of the encounter, and Bungie then forces them to make decisions under pressure while still reeling from that initial surprise. It's a wonderful combination. The music playing during the encounter carries on into the next area, and it's during this section that one of the biggest problems with Quarantine Zone quickly becomes apparent. The soundtrack starts out at a high tempo during the first meeting with the Flood piloted vehicles, perfectly matching the action on screen. Flood are running along the ground or taking on players in vehicles while sentinels attack from above, and the whole engagement is a very high octane affair. The same track continues into the next area, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but upon reaching its end and entering Quarantine Zone's third major area, it abruptly stops. Not a huge problem, you might think. After all, Halo doesn't always have music playing in the background. But because players are most likely in a vehicle, the sounds of gunfire, explosions and other vehicles sound quite far away, which is made worse by the fact that most of the vehicles and enemies in the area are also quite far away. This isn't so much of a problem during the many encounters which take place on foot during the series, as players are close to the action and the sounds of gunfire, vehicles and enemies and allies chattering away is enough to create an engaging soundscape regardless of whether music is playing or not. But in areas like this, which are particularly prevalent during Quarantine Zone, everything is much quieter to the point it begins to feel somewhat disconcerting. There's a feeling of being disconnected from the action, which becomes especially obvious in an area as expansive as this one, where at times much of what's happening in front of players is happening quite a long way away. The area is too big to traverse on foot and is clearly designed for vehicular combat, so punctuating the near silence with close combat isn't an option. With that being the case, what Quarantine Zone really needed was a bit more music to help keep the tempo up during moments like this, which do involve combat, but also require players to spend a fair bit of time driving from encounter to encounter. On a more positive note, despite the issues I've just mentioned, this area can at least be quite visually striking. The yellows of the rockets fired by the Enforcers contrasted against the blue plasma fired by the Wraiths can be rather beautiful, and by designing the geometry of the area on an incline and including plenty of enemies who fire projectiles into the sky, Bungie does a great job of guiding players' view towards the end of the area and slightly above ground level, at which point they'll notice the looming presence of the library itself. Things continue in a similar vein for the next area, except in a less visually striking environment, before players are forced to leave their vehicles to progress. Where the vehicle sections up to this point are relatively engaging, or perhaps much more entertaining than that depending on your preference for vehicle sections in Halo titles, Quarantine Zone's mid-level on foot section is nowhere near as interesting. It basically continues on from Sacred Icon and features Flood and Sentinel encounter after Flood and Sentinel encounter, with little else to break up the monotony. It's not any more of the same, but the areas these fights take place in are visually quite unappealing, and I'd argue the mission as a whole would have probably benefited from being shorter and having this part cut entirely. The biggest problem with it is that it makes Quarantine Zone as a whole feel very inconsistent. A level using only vehicles would have been something very different from every other mission in the series, but as it stands, the on-foot section is not only boring, it dilutes the impact of the mission as a whole and destroys any sense of pacing it may have once had. If there was a little more story thrown in during this segment to balance out the lack of exposition during the vehicle sections, it might have been a worthy inclusion, but in its current form, it adds very little. Eventually players arrive in another more open area and proceedings revert back to being vehicle based. There's not a whole lot to talk about during the next few areas, although the opportunity to fight Flood driving a Warthog a second time is a welcome one. Bungie were apparently keen for players not to fight Marines while playing as the Arbiter, hence the Flood and Sentinel heavy levels he's featured in until Halo 2's final stages, at which point players also have the opportunity to take on what's left of the Covenant, and so using the Flood as a replacement, especially when it comes to human vehicles, is in principle a very good idea. Unfortunately, however, the mission soon begins to drag again due to the samey encounters. At this point, some might make the argument that it's meant to be like this. Fighting through countless areas filled with Flood both on foot and in vehicles is meant to demonstrate just how great a force they are. The thing is, this isn't Combat Evolved in the library, where Bungie could arguably just about get away with that. Players have seen the Flood plenty of times already, they're aware that there's a lot of them, and that they are an overwhelming force in terms of numbers. It's not teaching players anything new. Yes, Flood using vehicles are thrown into the mix and players get to fight the occasional Warthog, but it's not enough to negate the feeling that Quarantine Zone needed something more, especially since the behaviour of Flood piloted Covenant vehicles is seemingly not that different from those piloted by the Covenant themselves. I've already spoken about how much I dislike the on-foot section which punctuates the vehicle segments earlier in Quarantine Zone, and there's one more to deal with at the end of the mission, and unfortunately, it's another gondola ride. A quick cutscene shows Halfjaw lending support and Tartarus offering to cover the Arbiter before he begins making his way across, which I'm sure Bungie hoped would throw players off the scent of his betrayal which follows soon after, and it sets up the interesting scenario of a human-controlled gondola being on its way to the same destination just a little way ahead. But instead of throwing in something different at this point, perhaps a fight against humans on an adjacent gondola, players get to fight the Flood on a slow-moving platform. Although arguably a more engaging trip on a slow-moving platform than the one featured in Sacred Icon, it's still another trip on a slow-moving platform, and I'm honestly staggered Bungie chose to throw it in towards the end of this mission. It's also one of the most unforgiving areas in terms of checkpoints in the entire series. I was 1 or 2 encounters away from finishing the ride when recording the footage for this video, died because I'm not that good at video games anymore, and had to do the whole segment again from its start. I have a fairly high tolerance for failure in video games. I'd have to, given I'm no longer the young man who could finish the entire Halo campaigns alone on Legendary, but on this particular occasion I genuinely had to take a short break as I couldn't face going back to such a slow-moving few minutes again. I think this entire section should have been a cutscene, and Bungie should have instead included a final vehicle scene. The level is already known by most as one that's mainly about vehicles, so throwing that in would have cemented the connection in players' minds and ensured Quarantine Zone remained a memorable mission. But instead, we get the gondola, and it does take some of the shine off what at times can be a fairly engaging level. The final few scenes of Quarantine Zone are a nice throwback to Combat Evolved's library, with a nod to it included by Bungie in the form of the chapter name, that old familiar feeling, but it's perhaps the shortest and most uneventful chapter in the entire series, with little else on offer other than a few bodies scattered on the ground leading into the mission's final scene. The final scene is a good one, and although many would have seen the betrayal coming, it's handled really well, and there's more symmetry, with the fate of the Arbiter lining up with that of Master Chief a couple of missions earlier, which sets up well the pair's meeting with the Gravemind shortly after. My biggest problem with Quarantine Zone is that there's clearly an amazing mission in there somewhere. Indeed, the first major combat encounter proves that Bungie did have the ability to create interesting scenarios involving predominantly vehicular combat, but a mid-level on-foot section and a gondola ride that outstays its welcome means the mission's more engaging parts are weighed down by its bad parts, and its bad parts are not great. The vehicle sections are memorable, but the on-foot parts of Quarantine Zone are orders of magnitude worse than anything featured in Sacred Icon. Something I didn't really mention as I talked through the mission was its story, as there isn't much exposition at all during Quarantine Zone, and this indicates to me that what we got in Halo 2 either wasn't finished or was included at the last minute to pad things out. Sacred Icon was an unexciting mission, but I'm not sure how much more Bungie could have done using its current framework, whereas Quarantine Zone is incredibly disappointing because I think if Bungie had ditched everything else and focused entirely on vehicles, it could have been something really special. Although even then, I'd still rather it not take place directly after Sacred Icon. Now that I've finished examining both missions, here's my big problem with Sacred Icon and Quarantine Zone. They take two parts of Halo that combine so brilliantly together and don't really do as much as they could with them. The missed opportunity here is that rather than simply connecting them with a cutscene in the middle, Bungie could have much more thoughtfully woven both of them together. In my mind, what these two levels had the potential to be was a much darker version of Combat Evolved's Assault on the Control Room. Instead of featuring indoor encounters which are entirely vehicle free in Sacred Icon, and then separately mostly outdoor sections featuring almost entirely vehicle combat in Quarantine Zone, players could have moved between indoor and outdoor areas much more frequently. At first they'd battle the Flood and a few Sentinels and things would seem fairly run-of-the-mill, but then the first Flood vehicle sections would be introduced to keep players on their toes, before the mission continued to alternate between the two in a similar manner to how brilliantly Assault on the Control Room does things. And it would help so much with pacing too. Something I've talked about being one of the Halo series' main strengths before is the way Bungie designs levels in such a way that they move fluidly between narrow sections, more open sections and back again, or vice versa. It's a huge factor in why so many of the series' missions feel extremely varied, even if the areas in which battles take place oftentimes aren't that dissimilar from each other. By taking Sacred Icon and Quarantine Zone and melding them together to create one large level with a similar structure, what at present feels like two flawed levels back to back would begin to feel like a single much more interesting journey through an area that would feel familiar in terms of design, but would at the same time be thrown on its head by the presence of the Flood, on foot and in vehicles. Instead, what players end up taking on in Halo 2 is a pair of levels which both feature a near singular focus in terms of their design, but would have benefited by borrowing a few sections from each other. There's nothing inherently wrong with a first-person shooter featuring a mission that mostly revolves around combat in narrow arenas, or a mission that focuses mostly on vehicle combat in much more open spaces. Indeed, in many games that would be enough to suffice. But in a series like Halo, one where there are so many examples of its levels doing both at the same time, I can't help but look at Sacred Icon and Quarantine Zone and wonder whether they could have been so much more. Thanks for taking the time to watch the video, and do consider subscribing if you enjoyed it. I really appreciate your support, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon.